how do you think the pandemic era, the remote working, working from home, all those other things, uh, in terms of putting your dynamic contingency model to work, um, are there ways in which you think that organizations who are still frankly wrestling with this, there's a lot of tension still in those areas, are there ways in which you'd encourage them to say, yeah, this is a useful lens to think about that contemporary world that we're in, trying to lead and manage people and reward and recognize them?
Yeah, I think so, and I think what happened over the pandemic, and of course the kind of cost of living crisis as well, following hard on the heels of that. I think it's been a fascinating time for not great to live through it, but it's fascinating from a reward perspective, because employees after the pandemic were very much saying, actually, we really value being, a couple of things really. A, being trusted to work autonomously and out of sight, not being monitored all the time by superiors. And that, again, we talk about it in the book, the well-worn sort of, phrase, it's a work-life balance, being hugely important to people. And I think that has taken that took at the time many employers by surprise, that was such a salient factor in people's, you know, employment satisfaction. And then I think with the cost of living crisis as well, I think having and there's been some fairly complex outcomes of that in employment for people. Um, that we've ended up in situations where people who perhaps formerly would have felt like they've been paid pretty well were struggling to do the things, normal things in life that they needed to do. And how employers respond to that is, as you say, I think back to this sort of this model of working within a context and with some choices. And I think that's really important. I don't really kind of ascribe to this notion of the sort of toolbox approach necessarily, but at the same time, we know, and this is why, to me, pay and reward is so exciting. Is that it's absolutely at the heart of the employment relationship, and the choices that organisations make when they are putting together their, lots of different terms for it, but value proposition or offer, for the employees is really central, and we can't ignore those things, those wider societal things that are happening that have, or economic things that have an impact. And I think where we're going next on this is going to be very, very interesting indeed. Um, we have, we're looking at the autumn and the employment rights bill, and the potential end to a lot of the real casualisation of work, with 0 hours contracts potentially, being certainly, well, yeah, I mean, we'll see what happens, but certainly impacted. And we've got things like the extension of statutory sick pay to lower paid workers as well. And we know that when the statutory enforcement of, sort of enhanced rights, employment rights, good employers often respond because they want to differentiate as well. So we see that, and we have seen the gap between the living wage and the average wage in the UK closing. And so, looking positively at this, I think we could be about to see some really sort of innovative and interesting responses from employers, good employers, in terms of how they attract and retain talent. as we go forward. There's some interesting work, interesting sort of commentary in the press around the potential shift in the kind of balance of power between employers and workers, with workers' rights being enhanced again. And so we may need, we need some creative thinking and some some work, I think, to try, in the profession to look at that and see how employers can best respond to some of those pressures. So yeah, I think that's really interesting. I think the other really big interesting thing that we will want to go carefully with, but respond to is AI. I think we will absolutely be seeing more. But it's there already, clearly. But I think there's more work to, and again, being positive about it, there's massive opportunities for the sort of data analysis and predictive forecasting, and with really, if I think my little CIPD spreadsheet was complicated, there's incredible amounts of work that can be done on really complex data sets out there, which can bring real positives. And again, I'm reading a blog the other day that was talking about the power of these things to spot things like biases and unfairness, sort of baked into some of these areas. And I think using it as a force for good is one way of going. But also on a slightly more sort of prosaic level, I think we're seeing AI assistants in nearly every sort of field. Just using Zoom today, I'm being asked if I want to catch up with my AI companion, and I think we'll see that a lot more in employment, and particularly navigating things like individual benefits packages, or various different arrangements. I think we'll see that sort of personalisation and tailoring really taking off in those fields. So I think there's some really interesting things happening, both in the sort of political changes, but also technological as well. Good old steeple or pestle factors coming in.
As ever, why change a good friend?
Absolutely.
It can still help you answer the questions.
Yeah.
In a way, what you've just been talking about goes back to the theme you introduced very early on, reflecting on your earlier career experiences of the collective versus the individual.
Yeah.
I mean, if one thinks about employment legislation, but once upon a day, then obviously if you have very strong unionisation, almost universally, public and private sector, the scope for individuals not to feel isolated, to enforce that. Have you got to go to the courts? You're going to an employment tribunal. Well, that's become professionalised and potentially flies against the face of people working things out on a common sense basis. On the other hand, as you say, artificial intelligence, is that something that we see in collective terms, or is it hugely individualized? Clearly, as you say, the opportunity when you're weighing up personalization of total reward packages, then it can be very useful spotting certain issues where bias has crept in. Although, of course, we've got to think about the biases inherent in the training data
Indeed.
that the model has picked up on. But I mean, is there something there that, again, somebody that's approaching this, let's start to, what two strands? First of all, just in terms of thinking about organizations and the kind of measures they're setting for themselves now, it's kind of become controversial again. Was certainly something that potentially was going to go the way of agile working as just a slogan, but those things that are equality, social and governance factors, the ESG agenda for organizations to measure themselves and what they're doing. On the other hand, then thinking about the possibilities, if you're looking at students coming to work under your supervision in the future, as we look into our crystal ball, as we start to bring our conversation to an end, what are the kind of things you might be advising them to start looking at, to think about, to build on, yet again, build on, in this case, the work that you've done, the challenges that you put forward?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think, I mean, as I sort of mentioned before, I think I'd always encourage students to follow where their interest lies, and to really sort of seek out the stories that are informed by their own experiences and their own reading and so on. So I think that's the first thing to say. But I think areas that I think are will be interesting. I think AI will be. I think probably it will continue to be something that people want to look at. And I think the I think the one of the things that we have had to face, I think, in recent times in this country, but perhaps more broadly as well, is this idea of government, governments almost subsidizing employers. That the majority of people who take social services benefits in the country are working, but they're not being paid enough, or they're not having enough work to make a living. And I think that sort of broader social justice agenda is something that I think is perhaps an area to look at. And I think particularly with cost of living, you hear stories of professional people, nurses, all sorts of different people, even academics, doing additional work out of the 9 to 5, evening work and things to try and make things ends meet. And I think that's to me that's a really interesting area of it's probably much broader than reward management, really, but it's an interesting area to focus on. I think for back into the organisational context, I think it probably comes back to where we perhaps started, that pay being this crucial part of reward, being a crucial part of a good healthy employment relationship, and all the different components of that have an impact in maintaining that relationship in a way that that meets the needs of the employees, meets the needs of the organisation. Yeah, I'm not sure I'm being ever so clear on this in terms of particular areas to focus on, because I think there's a lot of there's a lot in there around that as you said before, the effort pay bargain and all sorts of different sort of areas and scope for some really interesting work to be done. But I think I'm struggling to, because there's so much, I suppose I'm struggling to kind of nail it down too tightly. But I think as I said before, pay is such an important part of of employment that it not only has huge potential in terms of research, but from a practitioner point of view, that if you can get that right, it's a huge lever that you can pull. It's a dangerous one too, but it's a huge lever that you can pull to have a really positive impact on the working environment. And I think that's why it's such an interesting area for me.
Well, I agree with you. As I said earlier on, we're pay evangelists, but on the other hand, this is really important. And what you've said is that one can do good if you manage it right. I remember there's a guy called John Brannigan who used to lead reward for Hewlett Packard, got a lot of years ago, and he said can do a lot of damage with reward. And I thought it's interesting for the guy that's meant to be the reward strategist, but it's true, because if you give the wrong message to people, well, then they're going to react accordingly. So you've got a dynamic contingency there. It's been great. We've ranged around so many things. I really value. Thank you, your insights. Do you think there's anything, just reflecting back over what we've covered, that maybe I should have asked you to talk about? Anything I've overlooked?
That is a good question. And I can't think of anything, Stephen, actually. I think, as always, you've been the consummate host and professional. No, I can't think of anything that we haven't particularly covered. I suppose one of the areas that I think, again, back to the kind of employee responses a bit. As I think one of the areas, and again, perhaps this is what I could have said earlier. In terms of an area that's ripe for research, I think is the impact on different groups. And there's a fair bit out there on generational differences. How we split those generations is interesting, but I think that's a really, we're always looking at the youngest generation, aren't we, and thinking, well, how are they going to respond to? And I have the pleasure of having sort of grown-up children now who are entering the workforce post-university for sort of proper workforce for the first time, and seeing it for sort of first-hand how they are responding to some things that we have perhaps taken for granted in employment, and working from home or not being able to work from home, for example, is one of those things. So I think that's going to be a really interesting area that we haven't perhaps sort of driven down into, but also other marginalized groups, areas where it's closing, but we still have a gender pay gap, still equity issues in pay with other groups as well. It becomes a little bit more complex to get the data in those respects. But I think there are some of those areas that, as identity becomes more important to people, and really again designing systems that meet the needs of different groups, I think is going to be really, really important. We've been on that journey for a while, but I think there's more that can be done always.
Well, which is good, because at least that's it. There's always work to be done. So nobody's ever going to be lacking, whether AI enabled or not. That's the point.
It is, and speaking to a finance director for a big company the other day, and she was saying, we were talking about AI in finance, and obviously it's very well developed there. And she was saying, wherever you have high tech, you also need high touch. You need that human intervention and oversight and interpretation. You need, it's got to be the human that's doing the sense making. And I thought that was a really kind of, wherever there's high tech, you need high touch. And I think that's a good rule to think about in terms of using AI.
That's a very optimistic note on which we can conclude. I said at the start, thank you, because I know your time is very limited. It's really kind of you. I just would say it's a real privilege always to have the opportunity to work with you. I value so much the things that we've managed to do over the years. And if Coke and Page ask us, you never know, we're in our 5th edition now. Perhaps there'll be another one at some stage. But
well, likewise, Stephen, it's been an absolute pleasure to catch up and talk reward for all this time as well. It's lovely. It's not an opportunity I get an awful lot nowadays. So it's been wonderful. Thank you so much for inviting me.